The great crystal towers of Nexus Prime gleamed like diamonds against the star field. Inside the massive space station, beings from across the galaxy gathered in the central council chamber. Admiral Kessatar of the Vexhai stood at her command. Post, her crystalline body catching the light from a dozen different suns. Her 6 arms moved in precise patterns as she reviewed the reports on her holographic display. Something was wrong in the Outer Rim territories. The first report had come. 3 days ago, Deep Space Monitor Station Omega-7 had simply stopped transmitting. No distress call, no emergency beacon, no final message. One moment the automated systems were sending their regular updates about stellar radiation and cosmic dust levels. The next moment, silence. Kessatar had seen this kind of thing before. Equipment failed sometimes. Pirates raided isolated stations. Space was dangerous, and the galaxy was vast. But then Station Omega-12 went quiet. Then Omega-15. Then the patrol. Ships sent to investigate Omega-7 never reported back. Now 5 monitoring stations and 3 patrol vessels had vanished without a trace. The Admiral's aide, a young Vexhai named Ketrin, approached with careful steps. Admiral, the Council is ready to begin the emergency session. Kessatar nodded and made her way to the great chamber. The Council chamber was enormous, designed to hold representatives from 47 different species. Floating platforms and atmosphere-controlled pods accommodated beings who breathed different gases or lived in different gravity fields. The chamber buzzed with dozens of languages being translated in real time. At the center of the chamber, High Counselor Threnvak of the Korthak spoke in his species' clicking language. The universal translator converted his words into something other species could understand. These disappearances are nothing more than equipment failures and pirate raids. We should not waste the Council's time with routine security matters. Several other counselors nodded in agreement. The Luminari representative, a being of pure energy contained in a special field generator, pulsed with what might have been amusement. The slug-like Graxians shifted their massive bodies and made wet sounds that translated as laughter. Kessatar felt anger building in her crystal heart. These fools had forgotten the lessons of history. They had grown fat and lazy in the 300 years since the humans disappeared. They thought the galaxy was safe now. Honorable counselors, Kessatar said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustics. I must disagree with High Counselor Threnvak. These are not random equipment failures. The chamber grew quiet. Kessatar was known for her careful words and clear thinking. When she spoke, others usually listened. The missing stations form a pattern. They are all located along the same general vector, pointing toward the void zone. The ships sent to investigate have also vanished. This is not the work of common pirates. High Counselor Threnvak made a dismissive gesture with his 4 arms. The void zone has been empty for 3 centuries, Admiral. Since the humans were driven out, nothing of importance has come from that region of space. At the mention of humans, the chamber grew even quieter. Most of the younger counselors had never seen a human. They knew about them only from history files and old war records. But the older members remembered. Kessatar was old enough to remember the Terran expulsion wars. She had been a young officer then, serving under Admiral Veskar. She remembered her commander's final words before his death. Never assume the humans are truly gone, young Kessatar. That species has a way of surprising everyone, especially when you think you have beaten them. Perhaps, Kessatar said carefully. We should send a larger force to investigate, a full battle group with heavy sensors and communication relays. Counselor Morthek of the Hegemony States spoke up. That seems excessive for a few missing monitoring stations. We have trade disputes to settle and mining rights to negotiate. The galaxy has real problems that need our attention. Other counselors murmured agreement. The galaxy had indeed prospered in the 3 centuries since humanity's defeat. Trade flowed freely between worlds. Wars were small and contained. The major powers had divided up the old human territories and grown rich from the resources they found there. Earth itself had been stripped of anything valuable and left as a monument to what happened to species that defied the galactic order. The other human colonies had been absorbed into existing empires or left abandoned. It had been a clean victory for civilization. Kessatar looked around the chamber at the comfortable, satisfied faces of the other counselors. They truly believed. They were safe. They had forgotten that the humans had never formally surrendered. They had simply gathered their remaining ships and vanished into the void zone, the empty region of space beyond the galactic rim where no sane species would try to live. "I will send one patrol ship," High Counselor Threnvak decided. "If it finds anything significant, we can discuss sending more forces. But I will not waste valuable military resources chasing shadows in empty space." The session moved on to other business: trade agreements, territorial disputes, resource allocation, the normal, boring work of governing a peaceful galaxy. Kessatar tried to pay attention, but her mind kept returning to those missing stations. After the session ended, she returned to her quarters on Nexus Prime. The Admiral's private rooms were decorated in the traditional Vexhigh style, with crystal formations that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. But tonight, the light seemed dim, and the reflections looked like shadows. Kessatar activated her personal communication system and called up the old files from the Terran expulsion wars. Most of this information was classified at the highest levels. Very few beings in the galaxy had access to the complete records of humanity's final defeat. The files painted a picture that was different from the official history taught in schools. Yes, the humans had been outnumbered. Yes, their technology had been inferior to the combined might of the galactic powers. But they had not been completely crushed. The final battle at the Centaurus sector had been a human defeat, but not a rout. The human fleet had fought with a desperation and creativity that impressed even their enemies. When defeat became certain, they had not surrendered or fled in panic. Instead, they had executed a careful withdrawal, saving as many ships and people as possible. Admiral Vesikar had been there. His reports described the humans' final transmission before they vanished into the void zone. The message had been simple and chilling. "We go now to learn what we must become. When we return, the universe will know what it means to face a species that refused to die." At the time, the galactic powers had assumed this was just human bravado, empty threats from a beaten enemy. But Admiral Vesikar had taken the words seriously. He had spent the rest of his life monitoring the void zone, watching for any sign of human activity. He had found nothing. Now, 300 years later, monitoring stations were disappearing along the edge of the void zone. Ships sent to investigate were vanishing without a trace, and the comfortable, peaceful galaxy slept on, unaware that something might be stirring in the darkness between the stars. Kester closed the files and stood at her window, looking out at the vast star field. Somewhere out there, in the empty spaces beyond the rim, something was moving. She could feel it in her crystal bones, the way her people could sense changes in the cosmic background radiation. The giants were waking up, and when they opened their eyes, the galaxy would tremble. Dr. Zeflin floated through the abandoned mining tunnels of Kepler 442b, her energy form casting a soft blue glow on the ancient metal walls. As a luminari, she existed as pure, conscious energy contained within a portable field generator. This made her perfect for exploring dangerous ruins where solid beings might be crushed or poisoned. The mining world had been abandoned for over 200 years. Once, it had been a major human operation, extracting rare metals from the planet's core. When the humans disappeared, other species had tried to restart the mining, but the tunnels were too dangerous and the equipment too strange. Eventually, everyone gave up and left the world to slowly decay. Zeflin was here because she was a xenoarchaeologist. She studied the ruins and artifacts left behind by extinct or vanished species. Human sites were especially interesting because they revealed so much about how humans thought and lived. Most species built things in predictable ways, following logical patterns. Humans built things that worked, even when they made no sense. She drifted deeper into the tunnel system, following her portable scanner. The device was detecting some kind of data storage system deeper in the mining complex. After hours of careful navigation through collapsed passages and flooded chambers, she found what she was looking for. The human data center was surprisingly intact. Emergency power cells still functioned after 3 centuries, keeping the computers in low-power standby mode. The room was filled with processing units and storage arrays built in the efficient, blocky style that humans seemed to prefer. Everything was functional rather than beautiful. Zephlin extended a tendril of her energy form and carefully interfaced with the computer system. Human computer networks were notoriously complex and filled with security systems, but this was a mining operation, not a military base. The security was meant to keep out casual intruders, not determined xenoarchaeologists. The files she found were incredible. Most of the data was routine mining reports, personnel records, and equipment maintenance logs. But buried deep in the system was something much more interesting. A set of files marked with the highest level of human military encryption. Files that had been automatically transmitted to this remote mining station as part of some kind of backup protocol. Zephlin spent hours carefully breaking through the encryption layers. Human cryptography was always challenging because it was based on mathematical principles that made sense to human brains but seemed chaotic to other species. Finally, she managed to access the files. What she found made her energy form flicker with shock. The files contained the final military communications from the last days of the Terran expulsion wars. Not the sanitized versions that appeared in galactic historical records, but the raw, unedited transmissions between human commanders, as their civilization faced extinction. The humans had known they were going to lose. Their military leaders had no illusions about their chances against the combined might of 47 different species, but they had not been planning to simply give up and die. Admiral Sarah Chen, the last supreme commander of human forces, had sent a message to all human settlements just before the final battle. Operation Exodus is now in effect. All civilian populations are to report to designated evacuation points. Military forces will conduct delaying actions to allow maximum civilian evacuation to the void zone staging areas. But the most chilling message was the final transmission, sent from Admiral Chen's flagship just before it disappeared into the void zone. We go now to learn what we must become. The galaxy has shown us that being human is not enough. When we return, the universe will know what it means to face a species that refused to die. Zephlin stared at the message for a long time. This was not the desperate threat of a beaten enemy. This was a promise, a declaration of intent. The humans had not fled in panic. They had executed a planned withdrawal with a specific purpose in mind. She copied all the files to her personal storage system and began the long journey back to civilization. But even as she traveled, more disturbing reports were coming in from across the galaxy. The merchant ship Golden Prophet reported a strange sighting near the Horsehead Nebula. Their sensors had detected a massive object moving through deep space, but when they tried to get a closer look, their instruments showed nothing there. The captain insisted he had seen something vast and dark blocking out the stars for a few moments before it vanished. A Korthak patrol fleet investigating the Crab sector sent increasingly confused reports. They had found debris from one of the missing monitoring stations, but the wreckage was wrong somehow. The metal had been changed. At the molecular level, transformed into something that was still recognizably human technology, but also fundamentally different. Then came the distress beacons. The first one appeared in the Vega system, broadcasting on an old human emergency frequency. But when rescue ships arrived, they found nothing. The beacon signal was coming from empty space. Worse, the message Itself was in a human language, but not one that any translator could understand. The words sounded human, but they carried meanings that seemed to exist beyond normal language. More beacons appeared, dozens of them scattered across the galaxy, each one broadcast for exactly 1 hour before falling silent. Each message was different, but they all shared the same quality of being human, yet not human. The voices spoke with harmonics that should have been impossible for organic vocal cords to produce. Dr. Zeflin brought her findings to the Galactic University on Nexus Prime. The Xenoarchaeology department was buzzing with excitement and fear. Professor Clenthar, the ancient Graxian who headed the department, listened to her report with growing alarm. "This changes everything we thought we knew about the human disappearance," he said, his slug-like body rippling with agitation. They were not fleeing in defeat. They were regrouping for something else entirely. Word of the discovery spread quickly through academic circles, then to government officials, then to the general population. Fear began to spread like a virus through the civilized worlds. The comfortable assumption that humanity was gone forever started to crumble. On the Korthak homeworld, the collective consciousness that guided their species began to experience something they had never felt before: uncertainty. The idea that the humans might return changed in ways that no one could predict, created cracks in their unified thought patterns. The Vex High increased their military patrols and began updating their defensive systems. Ancient weapons that had not been used since the Terran expulsion wars were brought out of storage and tested. But perhaps the most disturbing development came from the edge of civilized space. Long-range sensors began detecting gravitational anomalies in the void zone. Massive objects were moving in the empty darkness between the stars. Objects too large and too strangely shaped to be natural phenomena. Captain Mordun of the Galactic Defense Force received orders to take his battle group to investigate one of these anomalies. It was a routine mission, the kind of thing his ships had done 1,000 times before. But as his fleet approached the coordinates where the anomaly had been detected, his instruments began showing readings that made no sense. There was something there, something vast, but it flickered in and out of sensor range as if it existed only partially in normal space. When his ships got within visual range, his crew reported seeing shadows moving against the stars. Shadows that looked like ships, but ships built on a scale that defied belief. Mordun tried to establish communication, but received no response. He ordered his ships to move closer, but as they approached, the shadows faded away like mist. His sensors showed nothing. His visual observers saw only empty space, but deep in their hearts, every member of his crew knew they had seen something, something that watched them with invisible eyes before deciding they were not yet worthy of contact. The reports from Captain Mordun's expedition sent waves of panic through the Galactic Council. If the humans were returning, they were returning as something far beyond what they had been before. The galaxy that had celebrated their defeat now faced the possibility that humanity had used their 3 centuries of exile to become something unimaginably powerful. And still, the distress beacons kept appearing, broadcasting their impossible messages in languages that sounded human, but meant things that no translator could understand. The ghosts in the machine were stirring, and soon they would be more than ghosts. Commander Veltaco had been watching the edge of the Helix Nebula for 16 hours straight. Her 4 eyes tracked the sensor displays, while her tentacles worked the control interfaces of Deep Space Monitor Station Alpha Prime. This was supposed to be a quiet assignment, the kind of posting where nothing interesting ever happened. Then the universe changed. It started as a ripple in space itself. Her gravimetric sensors detected something massive moving through folded space, but the readings made no sense. Whatever was coming was bigger than a moon, but moving faster than light, without using any known form of faster-than-light drive. Station. "Commander," her aide called out, We're getting massive gravitational distortions bearing 047 Mark 12. Something big is coming out of hyperspace. Veltaco had seen ships emerge from hyperspace thousands of times. There was always a bright flash as the ship transitioned back to normal space, followed by the characteristic energy signature of cooling hyperdrive systems. But this was different. Space simply folded inward on itself, creating a darkness that seemed to swallow light. Then, without any flash or energy release, something emerged from the fold, something that made Veltaco's brain struggle to process what her eyes were seeing. It was a ship. It had to be a ship, but it was like no vessel in any database. The hull was dark as space itself, but seemed to reflect light that wasn't there. The shape was wrong somehow, combining curves that looked organic with geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And it was vast. Her sensors estimated it at over 50 kilometers long. "Commander," her communications officer said in a shaky voice. "I'm trying to hail the vessel, but I'm not getting any response on any frequency." Veltaco stared at the impossible ship. Deep in her memory, something stirred. Old stories her grandmother had told her about the war against the humans. Stories about ships that defied understanding and weapons that worked in ways that made no sense. "Send an immediate message to Galactic Command," she ordered. "Tell them we have a contact of unknown origin and impossible configuration. And send them everything our sensors are recording." The massive ship hung in space for exactly 1 hour. It made no hostile moves, sent no communications, and showed no interest in the monitoring station. It simply observed. Veltaco could feel it watching, even though no sensors detected any scanning beams or observation systems. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the ship folded space around itself and vanished. Within 6 hours, similar reports were flooding in from across the galaxy. The pattern was always the same. A single massive ship would appear at the edge of a star system, observe for a precise amount of time, then disappear. The ships were always different in design, but they shared the same impossible characteristics. They were too big, too dark, and too wrong for normal space. At Galactic Command, Admiral Kessatar stood before a holographic display showing the locations of every sighting. Red dots marked confirmed appearances of the unknown vessels. There were dozens of them scattered across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. "The pattern is clear," she told the Emergency Council session. "These ships are conducting a systematic survey of galactic civilization. They are mapping our defenses, our population centers, our industrial capacity." High Counselor. Threnvac clicked his mandibles nervously. "But who are they? The ships match no known design in our databases." Admiral Kestar felt a cold certainty in her crystal heart. "I believe they are human ships, changed and evolved, but human in origin." The chamber erupted in alarmed chatter. Many of the counselors had convinced themselves that the recent disturbances were caused by some unknown alien species from beyond the galactic rim. The possibility that humanity had returned was far more terrifying. "That's impossible," Counselor Morthek protested. "Humans never had technology like this. Their ships were crude and primitive compared to galactic standards." "Their ships were crude 300 years ago," Kessatar replied. "We have no idea what they might have developed during their exile." As if summoned by their discussion, the reports continued to stream in. The mysterious vessels were appearing in increasing numbers. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Each ship was unique, as if they were being grown rather than built according to standard designs. Captain Mordun received orders to intercept one of the vessels with his battle group. He had 12 of the most advanced warships in the Galactic Defense Force under his command. Ships equipped with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand the fury of stars. His target was a vessel that had appeared in the outer system of Rigel 7. Long-range sensors showed it to be smaller than some of the others, only about 20 kilometers long. Morden's tactical officers assured him that his battle group could handle anything that size. As his ships approached the coordinates, Morden felt a growing sense of unease. His sensors were having difficulty getting a clear reading on the target. The ship seemed to flicker between solid and transparent, as if it existed partially in some other dimension. Range to target, 2 million kilometers and closing, his navigation officer reported. All ships maintain formation, Morden ordered. Weapons charged but not targeting. We are here to communicate, not to fight. At 1 million kilometers, his sensors finally got a clear lock on the target. What they showed made Morden's blood run cold. It wasn't one ship. It was 50 ships, flying in perfect formation so tight that they appeared to be a single vessel. Each individual ship was about the size of his flagship, but they moved together with impossible precision. As his battle group watched, the formation began to separate, revealing the true scope of what they faced. All ships, maintain course, Morden ordered, trying to keep his voice steady. Continue attempts to establish communication. The human ships made no response to radio signals, subspace transmissions, or even simple light patterns. They simply hung in space, arranged in a perfect sphere around Morden's battle group. The formation was clearly defensive, but also demonstrated a level of coordination that should have been impossible without some kind of shared consciousness. Captain, his science officer called out, I'm reading massive energy signatures from the unknown vessels. Their power output is off the charts. Morden stared at the tactical display. His 12 ships were surrounded by 50 vessels that individually matched them in size and collectively outmassed them by more than 4 to 1. And these were apparently the smaller ships in the human fleet. All ships, prepare for emergency jump to hyperspace, he ordered quietly. On my command. But before he could give the order, something impossible happened. The human ships began to phase in and out of visible space. One moment, they were solid objects that his sensors could track. The next moment, they became translucent, ghosts that seemed to exist in some other dimension. They were demonstrating technology that made the galaxy's best science look like primitive fire-making. Morden's communication officer suddenly looked up with wide eyes. Captain, I'm receiving a transmission. From the unknown vessels? No, sir. From everywhere. The signal is coming from all around us as if space itself is speaking. The message came through every speaker on every ship in the battle group. The voice was human, but it carried harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. It spoke in perfect galactic standard, but with undertones that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the mind. Children of the galaxy, the voice said, we have returned. We are no longer what we were, but we remember what you made us become. Do not fear. Do not attack. We have learned patience in the darkness between stars. Watch now, and understand what 3 centuries of exile can teach a species that refuses to die. The human ships began to move, not away, but closer together, forming patterns that made Morden's eyes water to look at directly. They were demonstrating formations that existed in 3 dimensions, but suggested movement through others. Ships that had seemed solid became transparent. Ships that had seemed transparent became solid. The entire formation flowed like liquid while maintaining perfect geometric precision. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the human ships folded, space around themselves, and vanished. Morden's battle group was left alone in empty space, their instruments showing no sign that anything had ever been there. But every member of every crew knew they had witnessed something that changed everything. Humanity had returned, not as the desperate refugees who had fled 3 centuries ago, but as something new, something that had learned to exist beyond the normal rules of space and time. Back at Galactic Command, the reports from Captain Morden's encounter sent waves of terror through the High Command. If this was what humanity had become, then the galaxy faced a threat beyond anything in recorded history. And still the ships kept coming. Thousands of them now, appearing at the edges of every major star system, not attacking, not communicating beyond that single message, just watching, waiting, demonstrating power that made the combined might of the galactic civilizations look like children playing with toy weapons. The approach had begun, and the universe held its breath, waiting to see what humanity had learned in the darkness between the stars. 700,000. The count had begun 3 days ago. Deep space monitoring stations across the galaxy started tracking and cataloging every human vessel they could detect. At first, the numbers seemed manageable, hundreds of ships perhaps, a few thousand. Large enough to be concerning, but not impossible for the combined galactic fleets to handle. Then the numbers kept climbing. 5,000, 10,000, 25,000. The human ships weren't just appearing at the edges of star systems anymore. They were materializing throughout the galaxy, often in places where no ship should have been able to reach undetected. They appeared in the gravitational shadows of gas giants, in the hearts of nebulae, in the empty spaces between star systems where nothing had ever been built. Admiral Kessatar stood in the command center of Nexus Prime, watching the numbers climb, on the massive tactical display. Each red dot represented a confirmed human vessel. The display looked like it had broken out in a rash. "Current count?" she asked her aide. 698,412 confirmed. "Contacts," Ketrin replied, her crystal form flickering with stress patterns. "The number is still growing." Kessatar felt something break inside her chest. Not her body, but her understanding of the universe. 300 years ago, the humans had maybe 50,000 ships in their entire fleet. These numbers suggested that humanity had not just survived their exile, but had grown into something beyond galactic comprehension. In the council chamber, the emergency session had devolved into chaos. Representatives from 47 species were shouting in dozens of languages. The universal translators were overwhelmed, creating a babble of overlapping voices that made no sense. High Counselor Threnvok stood at the center of the chamber, his 4 arms raised for silence. "Order! We must maintain order!" But order was exactly what the galaxy had lost. The Korthak delegate was reporting that their collective consciousness was fracturing under the strain of trying to process the sheer scale of the human return. Individual, Korthak were breaking away from the hive mind, experiencing personal fear for the first time in their species' history. The luminary representative was pulsing erratically, her energy form fluctuating between different colors. "They exist partially in our dimension," she reported in a voice like static electricity. "We can feel them moving through the energy layers of space. They are not entirely in our reality anymore." Counselor Morthek of the Hegemony States was reviewing evacuation plans for the core worlds. "My government is considering full military mobilization. We should strike now, before they finish whatever they are planning." "Strike with what?" Admiral Kessatar asked. "Even if we gathered every warship in the galaxy, we would be outnumbered 10 to 1. And that assumes their ships are only as powerful as ours." As if responding to her words, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. The human ships were beginning to demonstrate their capabilities. Near the Andromeda Gate, a formation of human vessels had begun generating gravitational fields strong enough to bend light around them. In the Cygnus sector, human ships were phasing in and out of normal space so rapidly that they appeared to be in multiple locations simultaneously. Most disturbing of all, the ships near inhabited worlds were beginning to scan, not with conventional sensors, but with something that penetrated planetary shields and atmospheric barriers as if they didn't exist. They were reading the biological signatures of every living being on dozens of worlds. "They're taking a census," Dr. Zeflin reported from her research station. "They want to know exactly how many of us there are and where we live." The count reached 700,000 confirmed contacts just as the sun set over Nexus Prime's observation deck. Admiral Kessitar stood at the great windows, looking out at a star field that no longer seemed friendly or familiar. Somewhere, out there, invisible to her eyes but tracked by hundreds of sensors, human ships filled the space between worlds. Then the counting stopped. Not because there were no more ships to count, but because the humans had apparently decided that 700,000 was enough. The appearance of new vessels ceased abruptly, as if someone had thrown a switch. For 12 hours, the galaxy held its breath. The human ships remained in their positions, motionless and silent. They didn't respond to communication attempts. They didn't move toward strategic targets. They simply waited. The silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. In the Galactic Defense Force headquarters, General Korvax of the Hegemony States was coordinating evacuation plans for 36 core worlds. Military vessels were being loaded with civilians and sent toward the Outer Rim territories. If the humans struck, at least some portion of galactic civilization might survive. On the Vex-High homeworld, ancient weapons that had not been activated since the creation wars were being brought online. Weapons designed to crack moons and boil atmospheres. Weapons that the Vex-High had sworn never to use again after seeing the devastation they caused. The Graxian merchant fleets were scattering in all directions, carrying whatever they could save from the major trading centers. If civilization collapsed, someone would need to preserve the knowledge and technology that had taken millennia to develop. But it was on the Korthak homeworld that the most dramatic changes were taking place. The collective consciousness that had guided their species for 10,000 years was breaking apart under the stress of the situation. Individual Korthak were experiencing emotions they had never felt before. Fear, loneliness, confusion. For the first time in their history, they were learning what it meant to be truly alone with their thoughts. Then, after 12 hours of terrifying silence, the humans finally spoke. The message came simultaneously from every human ship in the galaxy. 700,000 vessels broadcasting in perfect synchronization across every frequency and communication method known to galactic science. But the transmission wasn't just electronic. It came through subspace relays, quantum communication, networks, and methods that shouldn't have existed. More disturbing still, the message appeared directly in the minds of every sentient being in the galaxy, not as words heard through the ears, but as thoughts that seemed to come from inside their own consciousness. The voice was human, but it was also more than human. It carried harmonics that suggested thousands of individual voices speaking as one, yet each maintaining its distinct character. It was beautiful and terrible, familiar and utterly alien. "Children of the galaxy," the voice began, "we have returned." Every conversation stopped. Every argument ceased. 7 trillion beings across the galaxy listened with perfect attention as humanity announced its presence. 300 years ago, you drove us from our homes. You scattered us to the dark spaces between stars because you feared what we might become. In your fear, you taught us the most valuable lesson any species can learn. You showed us that survival is not enough. Evolution is not optional. Change is the only constant in the universe. The voice paused, and in that silence, every listener could feel the weight of centuries. The patience of a species that had spent 300 years learning to become something new. We are no longer what we were when you cast us out. We have learned to exist beyond the boundaries of single dimensions. We have partnered with entities you cannot perceive. We have discovered technologies that make your greatest achievements look like cave paintings. But we are still human. We still remember. Admiral Kessitar felt her crystal body resonating with harmonics in the voice that she couldn't quite identify. It was as if the humans were speaking not just in words, but in fundamental forces that affected matter itself. We remember your fear. We remember your hatred. We remember the worlds you burned and the children you killed because you could not tolerate our existence. But we also remember something else. We remember that humans believe in the possibility of redemption. The transmission continued for several more minutes, but the core message was clear. Humanity had returned, transformed beyond recognition, but still recognizably human. They possessed power that made the galaxy's greatest weapons seem like toys. But they had not come for revenge. They had come for something far more profound. We do not seek conquest, the voice concluded. We seek conversation. We have learned what it means to transcend the limitations of biological existence while maintaining the essence of who we are. We offer to share this knowledge with those who prove themselves worthy of evolution. The transmission ended, leaving the galaxy in a silence that felt different from before. It was no longer the silence of fear, but the silence of possibility. 700,000 human ships hung in space around the civilized worlds, no longer as threats, but as teachers. But the greatest revelation was yet to come. For in the days that followed, as the galaxy struggled to understand what humanity was offering, the true scope of the human transformation would become clear. The 700,000 ships were not just a fleet, they were a civilization. Each vessel contained millions of human beings who had learned to exist as something more than purely biological entities. They had become a species that could live in the spaces between dimensions, drawing energy from the quantum foam that filled the universe. They had become what evolution looked like when guided by intelligence. What humanity became. The first human to appear in person came to Admiral Kessatar 3 days after the Great Transmission. She was in her quarters, studying tactical reports and trying to understand how 700,000 ships could maintain perfect position without any detectable communication between them, when her door chimed. Her aide was not at his post. Her security system showed no one in the corridor. But the door chimed again, soft and patient. Kessatar activated the entrance, and a human walked into her private quarters. She knew it was human immediately, despite the changes. The basic body plan was still recognizably the same species that had fought the galaxy 3 centuries ago. 2 arms, 2 legs, a head with bilateral symmetry. But everything else was different in ways that made her crystal form sing with harmonics of fear and wonder. The human skin seemed to shift between solid matter and something that looked like contained starlight. Eyes that had once been simple, biological organs now showed depths that seemed to contain galaxies. When the human moved, reality seemed to bend slightly around them, as if space itself was making room for their presence. "Admiral Kessatar," the human said, and their voice carried the same impossible harmonics as the fleet transmission. "My name is David Chen. I am a descendant of Admiral Sarah Chen, who led the final evacuation from the galaxy 3 centuries ago. I have come to speak with you because our records show that you are one of the few leaders who remembers the truth about what happened." Kessatar's training told her to call for security, to activate emergency protocols, to treat this as an invasion. But her instincts, honed by centuries of experience, told her something different. This was not a conqueror or an invader. This was something far more dangerous and far more hopeful. This was a teacher. "How did you get past my security?" she asked. David smiled, and the expression was heartbreakingly human despite everything else that had changed. "We exist partially, outside the normal dimensions of space and time. Your security systems are designed to detect matter and energy moving through conventional space. We can move through the spaces between atoms, between moments, between thoughts." He gestured to a chair, and Kessatar found herself sitting down without consciously deciding to do so. Not through any kind of mental control, but because the gesture somehow made sitting seem like the most natural thing in the universe. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Understanding," David replied. 300 years ago, the galaxy drove us out because they feared what we might become. They were right to fear, but for the wrong reasons. They thought we were dangerous because we were different. They didn't understand that we were dangerous because we had the potential to become something better. David began to move around the room, and as he did, the walls seemed to become transparent. Kessatar could see through the metal and crystal structure of Nexus Prime, out into space where the human fleet hung in perfect formation. When we fled to the Void Zone, we faced a choice, David continued. We could try to rebuild what we had, lost, recreate the same civilization that had been destroyed. Or we could use the opportunity to become something entirely new. The transparent walls now showed images that couldn't possibly be real. Kessatar saw human settlements built inside, the event horizons of black holes, drawing energy from the fundamental forces of gravity and time. She saw humans who had learned to exist as pure consciousness, their minds distributed across quantum networks that spanned light years. She saw children being born who could perceive dimensions that normal matter couldn't touch. We chose evolution, David said simply. We partnered with entities that exist in the spaces between realities. We learned to modify our biology at the cellular level, then at the quantum level. We discovered that consciousness itself is a force that can reshape matter and energy. Kessatar stared at the impossible images surrounding her. But you're still human. I can see it in you. David's smile widened. That was the hardest part. Maintaining our essential humanity while transcending our biological limitations. Many of us lost themselves in the transformation, became something so alien that they could no longer relate to the beings they had once been. But we learned that evolution without identity is just another form of extinction. The images changed, showing human communities that looked almost normal from a distance. Families, children playing, people working together on projects and goals. But as Kessatar looked closer, she could see the differences. These humans moved through solid matter when it was convenient. They communicated through direct transfer of thoughts and emotions. They shaped their environment with conscious will rather than physical tools. We spent 3 centuries learning to become more than human while remaining essentially human, David explained. We retained our curiosity, our creativity, our capacity for love and growth and change. But we transcended the limitations that had made us vulnerable to species who feared our differences. The walls became solid again, but now Kessatar could feel something different in the room, a presence that extended far beyond the physical form of the human standing before her. David was connected to something vast, a network of consciousness that spanned the entire human fleet. What do you want from the galaxy now? She asked. We want to offer you the same choice we made, David replied. Evolution or stagnation, growth or decay. The universe is vast and full of wonders that your current forms cannot perceive. We can teach you to transcend your limitations while maintaining your essential identity. Kessatar felt fear and hope warring in her crystal heart. And if we refuse? David's expression became sad but understanding. Then you will remain what you are. We will not force change on anyone. But the universe is evolving, Admiral. New forms of life are emerging that exist beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. Species that refuse to grow will eventually be left behind, not through conquest or war, but through simple irrelevance. Over the following weeks, more humans appeared throughout the galaxy, not as invaders or conquerors, but as teachers and guides. They came to the leaders of every major species, offering knowledge and transformation. The Luminari were among the first to accept. As beings of pure energy, they found it easier to understand the human concept of existing beyond normal matter. The humans taught them to extend their consciousness across multiple dimensions, to perceive forms of energy that they had never imagined existed. The Vexhi were more cautious, but their crystalline nature made them natural candidates for the quantum consciousness techniques the humans had developed. They learned to store and process information using the fundamental structures of space-time itself. Some species refused entirely. The Graxians, comfortable in their role as merchants and traders, saw no need to become something beyond their current forms. The humans respected their choice and simply left them alone, though they did provide advanced technologies that would allow them to interact with the evolved species when necessary. The Korthak faced a unique challenge. Their collective consciousness was already partially evolved beyond individual biological existence, but the human transformation offered them something they had never experienced: unity without loss of individuality. They could maintain their collective awareness while allowing each member to develop unique perspectives and capabilities. Most surprising was the revelation about Earth itself. The humans had not abandoned their homeworld. They had transformed it into something beyond a simple planet. Earth now existed partially outside normal space-time, serving as a nexus point for the human consciousness network. The planet had become a living entity, its biosphere integrated with technology that made no distinction between organic and artificial systems. "We never forgot where we came from," David explained to the Galactic Council during the first formal contact session. "Earth remains our heart, even though we have learned to exist far beyond its surface." The transformation of galactic civilization didn't happen overnight. It took decades for some species to complete their evolution. Others chose partial transformation, retaining their biological forms while gaining access to enhanced consciousness and perception. A few species declined entirely and were left to continue their existence unchanged. But the galaxy itself was transforming. Space lanes that had once required months of travel could now be crossed in moments by beings who could fold space around themselves. Planets that had been barren became gardens as consciousness learned to directly influence matter and energy. Wars became impossible when beings could directly share thoughts and emotions, understanding each other's perspectives on levels that made conflict meaningless. The humans had kept their promise. They had returned not as conquerors, but as teachers. They had faced the ultimate test of any civilization, the choice between revenge and redemption. They had chosen to offer their former enemies the same gifts they had given themselves. And in doing so, they had proven that evolution's greatest achievement was not the transcendence of biological limitations, but the expansion of compassion and understanding across all forms of consciousness. The universe no longer trembled in fear. It trembled with anticipation of what it might become when 700,000 teachers began sharing the secrets of conscious evolution with anyone brave enough to learn.